PGCE Research Bites, from the team behind Emma and Tom Talk Teaching. Hello and welcome to PGCE Research Bites, a showcase for the very best student-teacher research from the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education. My guest for this episode is Cameron Corsi, who's from PGCE Secondary Physical Education. Hi Cameron.
Hi Tom, you okay?
Hi, yeah, I'm good, thank you. So you've just completed a research assignment for us, which was on a topic that was given to you by your lead partnership school. Now, we're keeping schools anonymous in these because that's kind of what we do with our pieces of research. So we're going to follow that kind of convention with this. So we're not going to name the lead partnership school, but it's a school in South Wales. And they picked the topic for your research because it was of interest to that school. So what did they give you out of the hat?
Yes, my focus was blended learning.
It's a popular one with schools at the moment for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So you then had to make that big topic into something manageable for you, and I guess with some kind of subject-specific angle as well, did you? I mean, how did you narrow that big topic down?
Yeah, so obviously blended learning has become a local and national priority due to the lockdowns, as well as a school priority. It's a strategy that needs to be adopted by the schools sort of very quickly, with obviously most schools little time for planning. So we had to consider what effective blended learning looked like, what are the advantages to the learning method for both obviously teachers and the pupils, and the hindrances that affected blended learning. So what issues were surrounding the approach. Those are sort of the three main areas that I focused on within blended learning. Obviously, it's a broad topic.
Yeah, and I'm thinking as a fellow practitioner of a practical subject, I mean, I'm music, you're PE, I guess blended learning has some very specific kind of issues attached to it for you, like it does for us.
Yeah, there's many that obviously I come across during my, a clinical practice one, many that we had to overcome, and it was sort of a stepping stone. It was new to obviously us as PGCE students, but also the teachers, because a lot of them never experienced this before or come across the issues that they had to face. So it was a challenge for everyone, and I think we enjoyed it. The ones who embraced it more, I think, got more out of the approach. Some better than others, but yeah, overall, I think a lot of schools adopted it well.
And so for this assignment, you looked in depth into 6 pieces of literature, and you were able to kind of search far and wide for that literature and pull it together and see what you could make of it. So what were your 6 bits of literature, and what did you take from each of them? It was a big question, I know. I'm probably going to sit back at this point.
So obviously it took a lot of research and inquiry time. I started off, very broad, looking at, various different platforms of research, through MetSearch, Google Scholar, books, etc. We narrowed them down to my 6 sources, and the first one wasn't so much on the blended learning approach within actually schools. It was in a context of a factory, which I sort of applied to a teaching environment. So the first one was a source from Rossett and Frazee on blended learning approaches. It's actually from America. And in the formal report, they discussed their experiences of using the approach to help learners learn. They stated in their research, by studying a method used by teachers, they can use it within their milk distribution centre for youngsters. They utilised a blend of approaches and came to realise that the strategies could be applied in all forms of work, and then more importantly, in an educational context. And through their research, they identify what constitutes effective blended learning and identify the advantages and limitations of this approach. So that was sort of my first one. My second one then looked more into a blended learning approach in higher education, which obviously has been in place for a few years, I believe, more than within the younger schools in secondary school and primary school. So the second one, it was a peer review paper by Garrison and Kanuka. And it's provided discussion of the transformative potential of blended learning in the context of challenges being faced within education in the current times. It was founded upon a summary of blended learning and its potential to encourage deep and meaningful learning. And that was what was really reviewed within that peer-reviewed journal. And the journal moved towards the need to reconsider and rearrange the learning experience, and its potential to be transformed was analysed. So I looked at how it's used in university, and how they've used it to their advantage through, obviously, teams has been used a lot, and how basically the different functions that can be used within teams, how the schools can adopt it to make it fun and interesting within the school environment, because obviously that's what kids want. So that was my second source. And my third source then, it was more of a comparison of student satisfaction between traditional teaching, so your face-to-face, and your blended technology. And this source was particular to physical education. So I really dove into how it's used within physical education. Again, it's a peer-reviewed article, and it focused on a handful of lecturers and professors based in England. The group of professors, they looked at the issues surrounding e-learning and the teachers' concerns regarding alternate instructional delivery, the solutions that alleviate the issues sort of being faced. And while obviously the blended learning approach is being acknowledged as being an advantage to students, it was inadequate to sort of the learning satisfaction, and it was still a barrier to sort of successful implementation. So a bit of the research in there, it talks about the lack of learners' satisfaction as a hindrance to the effective of the implementation, in terms of students felt they were more active in face-to-face, whereas some individuals did not see the difference. Some individuals didn't see the difference in two, but some preferred that face-to-face interaction, being confident to ask questions, didn't feel silly or asking a question behind the screen that they couldn't see the teacher's reaction. Because a lot of students found, from the research I gathered, their questions were founded on how the teachers interacted from the questions they asked, and this then led on to further discussions. So that's what they found hard, was that collaboration. It felt like there's a barrier between asking questions and interacting, especially in PE, as we know, similar to your subject is music. It's a practical subject, and that interaction and collaboration is a massive tool or driving force within our subject, and students want to be able to do that. And sitting behind a screen and breakout rooms is a great tool, and some students loved it, but it's not the same as sitting in a classroom and around a table, or out on the pitch, on the field, and discussing what their plans are, or where they want to move forward. And I think that's one thing that was a barrier from that paper. Similar again, my next paper looked at the impact of blended learning and the traditional instruction of the students' performance. So this one again was looking at particular within physical education and in the specialists, and this one was about the sports scientists. So they explored the blended learning setting, outlining the hybrid notion of learning and the classroom learning environment that incorporates some of the accessibility of online learning without the complete loss of traditional learning advantages. So in this paper, within this study, the authors investigated the impact of face-to-face and blended learning in the pupils' performance within physical education. And they sort of found that, they identified that one-to-one teacher and student collaboration, the students' feedback was delayed and restricted to resources that the teachers can use within the lesson. It was acknowledged that, don't get me wrong, blended learning offers pupils choice and flexibility within the distance learning, coupled with individual interaction with the faculty and other pupils. But the blending teaching goes past barriers of culture, location, time, and it did, in ways, many improved the opportunities for not just the students, but the teachers also. And then the next one then was I looked at building effective blended learning programs. So how different programs could be applied or maybe considered within the educational context. So I looked at one journal. It was by Singh, and he provided an inclusive insight to blended learning and subsequent learning delivery approaches. The article provided models of blended learning, and it ensured that each sort of element independently and collectively adds to a meaningful learning experience. Within the article, there was a framework which I looked at by Badrul Khan, and this was used to guide, plan, deliver, and also evaluate blended learning platforms. So Singh pointed out that schools are constantly exploring approaches for effective learning, but they have to take into consideration a variety of concerns to guarantee effective learning delivery. Of course, there's many factors, factors involved, through technology and programs that the school have to, whether buy or download. There's a lot involved, and some of the research said that, the term blended learning, discovering in some cases it was just connecting face-to-face to e-learning activities, through synchronous learning. And it was emphasised that learning necessities and preferences of every student, tend to be different, and that teachers need to use the variety of blended learning methods in their approach to teaching to get the correct content in the correct format to the students. Many occasions I've seen it in school. Sometimes the content was delivered and it maybe wasn't fit for purpose, or they tried to force it across just to connect that face-to-face teaching to the e-learning activity. And that's the one thing that I sort of found from my experiences within school. And another thing that people did question from the research, the term blended learning is also involved much deeper to incorporate the set of learning methods. Blended learning is not a new approach. It has been used in the past, and it consisted of a physical. I'll try to give an example. So, in the past, blended learning consists of a physical classroom format, whether it's lab lessons, handouts, through reading books and lectures. But today, schools have many learning methods and choices that is bedded within the knowledge that learning is not just a one-time event, and that learning is a continuing process for individuals, which is very, very hard for teachers because it's a new concept. It's a new approach that to some teachers or lecturers it's second nature, but for the people who aren't maybe as confident in embedding this within the learning environment, it is very hard to challenge the learners to a level that they're constantly learning on the pathway. So that was probably the key message from that source. And the last one I looked at was blended learning or e-learning. So again, this was another peer-reviewed journal, and it consisted of two faculties of education. The study provided a broad analysis of the relevant literature around online and blended learning. It looked at the different understandings of the term blended learning and the practicality and efficiency, were further discussed, which I probably haven't got enough time to go into. And the authors considered blended learning to be the same as a hybrid instruction, which brings together the capabilities of web-based learning with those of classroom techniques, if you like. Throughout their report, or the source on the transformational potential of blended learning, the authors discovered that blended learning settings capture the principles of traditional classes, which enhance the effectiveness of the meaningful learning environments within the online concept. And they stated that blended learning provides a dynamic learning setting with the flexibility in using the materials for pupils, and offers more time to faculties for them to sort of apply valuable collaboration of their ideas. Either this can be individually, one-to-one, or through small groups. So it's sort of, it dived deeper into like the hybrid instruction. It has the ability to change a pupil's understanding and results through learning. And the thing that stood out the most for me here is, seeing pupils in school who, before this, so it was a hybrid approach because we were teaching some in school and some outside school, and some students weren't maybe accepting or engaging with face-to-face learning. But since we've gone to this hybrid notion, if you like, or the blended learning approach, some of these students who weren't engaging in classes are the first ones to answer questions, completing their work, using questions that they wouldn't have even thought about in that face-to-face environment. So I think it has had many positives for, in particular, some students who maybe have struggled with face-to-face, whether that's due to confidence barriers or, interactional. They're not very good at interacting. They're sitting behind the screen, it fills them with confidence. And that's the one thing that this blended learning approach has allowed, is some of these students who, maybe did struggle in that face-to-face environment have really flourished within the blended approach. And, there's many practicalities that, again, we can use from this blended learning approach. And some schools are very fortunate to have that technology. And I think, speaking to other researchers, is using this technology now within classes, not just going back to, to pen and paper or your standard PowerPoints, but having that interaction. There's so many things like Mentimeter or Padlet that create that collaboration, and you can still use that in the classroom. Just because we're not at home anymore, and they're uploading their answers to a web page, we can still use this in the classroom to test their knowledge, test their understanding, and move their understanding forward. That was sort of the key findings from that last one. But the one thing that I think stood out for me in terms of the hindrance of the last one was the direct collaboration. This communicates, many facial expressions, eye contact, a tone of voice and body language from the students. And one of the researchers, Lewis, spoke about the tone of voice and the pupils' facial expression are essential in the teaching. The brain requires and expects these additional important channels of information. And if these key features of interaction are not presented, the brain struggles to communicate this, leading to high possibility that there's a misconception might take place. And, I'm obviously learning. I'm on that teaching pathway of becoming a teacher, and you've obviously been teaching for many years. You probably understand that. Just by talking to a child, we can understand if they know what we're talking about, or if they're thinking, they're processing the message or the image they're trying to create in their head of what we're trying to do. And sometimes we can't see that from behind the screen where their camera's off. So yeah, it's just vital to communicate, and this doesn't happen when students are online learning. I think it's easy for them to sit back in a shell and and sit behind a screen. But I'm not going to neglect that some students have flourished and really took on that opportunity and excelled. But I think that was a massive hindrance for me, was not being able to see that interaction and fully grasp if they understand what we are trying to say.
Mm. There's just loads in there, isn't there? I mean, one of the real challenges for the number of you who were given blended learning in that school context is that it's not as simple as just searching for the literature about blended learning in schools, because as you've kind of alluded to there's quite a lot out there about blended learning in universities. I like you managed to find blended learning in a factory as well. But it's quite a job of work there to take the body of literature and work out how it applies to school and how it applies in your very specific subject domain, and kind of weave in your experience there that you've got as a practitioner. So there's absolutely loads in there. Now, one of the things that we asked people to do as part of the assignment was to create a visual version, a visual representation of this information that you've come across, and present it to your lead partnership school. So how did that go? What did they make of it? What did you actually tell them? What got boiled down into your visual summary, and what was the reaction there?
Yeah, so I broke. Obviously, again, it was like a 4,000 word essay, I think. So we covered a lot of content. So it was a challenge to sort of decide, or really be decisive on what you're going to use in your visual summary. So I was quite simple. I broke mine into maybe 4 or 5 sections. So my first section just sort of outlined the research focus. So that set the scene. I then looked at the rationale for my research focus. So the reasons behind my research method. Then I gave a little explanation of my research method, so some sort of background context. Further, then I moved on to my key findings from the research and my literature. So I explored what different authors and practitioners had to say about blended learning. Again, I probably went a bit off topic on my essay, but I looked at the wider approach and sort of tried to relate things in the outside world to education, because as we know in life, we use things not just in an educational context, whether it's in sport or business. We try and tie it in within education because it just broadens our knowledge, and it keeps education interesting. It keeps the children engaged. I then moved on to the main messages So the implications I found from my findings, and then I sort of summarised it by giving a few recommendations and possible next steps for my lead partnership school, and how blended learning can be embedded within their school environment. So just using some ideas that I found from researching and from my clinical practice, I use those ideas and then put them into onto the last slide then, so hopefully they can use within their blended learning.
Brilliant. And I'm sure they found that very, very useful moving forward. I mean, thinking about you now, because this assignment is not just for your school, I guess it's for you as well. How do you see, because you're about to change school placements as we're recording this, how do you see the next steps now for you as a teacher? And maybe also, what are you interested in future potentially as a researcher?
Oh yeah, so my next steps is in the teaching perspective is to consider what I've learned through this blended learning approach and apply it to my face-to-face teaching. So as much as I can, I want to embed technology within my lessons, because I feel like that's the way education's going and society's moving. Technology now is a massive aspect of society, and collaborate with my peers, but not just my peers on PE. People on my placement, I spoke to them about how they've used blended learning in their lessons, and just a variety of aspects that I can apply to my practice. And then sort of the next steps for me as a practitioner is, just keep researching different approaches. So, I'm really interested in differentiation at the moment. I had a lot of classes of looking at maths students, ALN students. So how I'm going to, within my lessons, challenge all learners. So that's going to be a massive thing, is looking at researching this differentiation, and also assessment of learning strategies. I think they're the two probably key approaches or research topics or areas, if you want to call them, which I'm going to further investigate.
Yeah, and really big things, AFL and differentiation for PE. I mean, that's a really, really big deal for you in that subject domain, and maybe even more so than some others.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Cameron. That was a whistle-stop rundown of an enormous amount of work that you've done there, and it was a fantastic piece of work that I know has been hugely appreciated by everyone who's read it. So thanks for taking the time to come and share it with me today.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to share my work.
PGCE Research Bites comes from the team behind Emma and Tom Talk Teaching and is presented this week by me, Tom Breeze. It showcases the best student-teacher research from the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education. Thanks to Cameron Corsi from PGCE PE, who joined us today to share his research. You can find the references to his 6 main pieces of literature and his visual summary in the show notes. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blandford and the music is by Cameron Stewart. We'll be back with a regular episode next week, and PGCE Research Bites will be back in a fortnight.